Chinese children of Korean extraction. One could still clearly make out the six-pointed stars of David in the building's fenestration. Not to be missed was Huangshan, the site of the largest extant Jewish cemetery in East Asia. Located on the outskirts of the city, it is the repository of Harbin's remaining Jewish gravestones, which were removed from their original location in the city center between 1958 and 1962 to make way for new construction, though it is not the location of the actual graves. One can view Semyon's somewhat eroded tombstone there today. In my experience, to study Jewish history too often means to visit places where Jews used to live, but no longer do. For me, this has included parts of the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and several cities in East Asia and on the subcontinent. The list also includes my hometown of Newark, New Jersey, which boasted a flourishing Jewish community of about 60,000 souls when I grew up there in the 1950s and 1960s. The magnificent old synagogue buildings still stand, most reincarnated as African-American churches. The cemeteries in which many of my forebears rest are also still there. But today, Newark probably counts fewer than 1,000 Jewish residents, the rest having long since fled to its suburbs. Newark's Jews came primarily from the Russian Empire, and they thrived in the city for about a century, give or take a decade or two, before moving on. But Russian Jews, just like my paternal grandparents, who headed east rather than west and wound up in Harbin, enjoyed a much shorter window there, about half the time, and unlike the Newarkers, who were in the main upwardly mobile and financially able to pack up and leave for suburbia, the Harbin Jews departed because they were more or less driven out. I never foresaw that I would someday learn enough about the Kaspes to write a book about them and others who called Manchuria home in the early 20th century, still less one centered in the very Hotel Moderne in which I had stayed. In the process, I would learn the full story of the Harbin Jews, from the arrival of the first Jewish man in 1899 to the death of the last Jewish woman in 1985, and understand how the tragic story of Semyon Kaspe contributed to the exodus of the community. And I would take a stab at solving the nearly century-old mystery of who was ultimately responsible for the young man's fate. Harbin's first Jews, like my grandparents, arrived at their destination at the turn of the 20th century, but nearly all were gone by 1949, when the communists took over China. For a short interval during those 5 decades, they felt safe from the oppression and violence that had plagued them in Russia. Eventually, however, Russians and their hatred caught up with them, and the arrival in 1931 of new Japanese overlords, who quickly joined forces with the Russians, made things for the Jews immeasurably worse. This is the story of the event in that short history, thought by many to be the harbinger of the end. Although the exodus had already begun a few years before it occurred, the Kaspe case persuaded many that remaining was no longer prudent, and that, like so many other times in the history of our people, it was time to move on. Researching this story posed an unusual set of challenges. First, mirroring the various ethnicities represented in Harbin, relevant materials exist in Chinese, Russian, Japanese, French, Hebrew, Yiddish, and English, not all of which are languages I understand. I have relied on linguistic help from people, as well as from Google and DeepL, machine translation websites that do a remarkably good job of bridging the language divide. Second, as a historian, I have a strong preference for primary materials. In this case, however, owing in part to the fact that certain archival documents are inaccessible to me and that others were not preserved, I have had to rely a bit more on secondary sources than is my wont. As with my other works of narrative nonfiction, the characters depicted in this book have not in any way been fictionalized. They really existed, and the events really occurred at the times indicated, although I have occasionally been